Hi, and welcome to What Developers Say About IntelliJ IDEA. I'm your host, Mala Gupta. And today I'm very excited to interview Josh Long, a dear friend and an amazing human being, apart from being a rock star developer. He's one of the main reasons why the Spring framework is so popular across the globe. The first Spring developer advocate, a Java champion, author of 6 books on Spring, and host of Beautiful podcast. Josh is also an international speaker who has inspired millions of people. Also, he has made start.spring.io one of the coolest places to hang out for all Spring developers. Hi, Josh. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you in this series.
Hi, my friend. Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to see you. I don't know who you were talking about, but I'm happy to be here. That other person sounds great. I wish it was. I wish I were half so cool. I was thinking about that. Uh, you and I used to both be international, and then of course this terrible virus took that away from us. I miss seeing you in person, right? Like the world is so much bigger now. It used to be so small because we could just get on a plane and be anywhere you wanted to be. Anyway, I miss you. I miss hanging out with you in person. I miss all that. It's been too long, but I'm glad to see you now. I'm so happy to see you now, and thanks for the kind words.
I hope we would be able to meet in person soon. Thank you so much. So, let me start with the first question, Josh, which is when did you start using IntelliJ IDEA and why?
2002, and I saw an ad in Dr. Dobbs' journal, Dr. Dobbs' programming journal, right? This magazine, and I was using Borland, right? Borland JBuilder, which was eventually Oracle had, or Sun had JDeveloper. Was it Oracle? Maybe it was Oracle back then. I don't know if it came from Sun and then it went to Oracle. It was just always Oracle, but they had JDeveloper, which was like a fork of that. And I was just trying, it was at this point I was just trying to like really get good at like the tool as opposed to just the syntax. So I was trying different things out, and I remember seeing this ad in a programming magazine, a printed ad, and I remember seeing it was just this very back then. This is as we record this, we're end of 2021, almost 2022, and so this is 20 years ago, right? And I remember the ad it showed this thing that looked like it was a giant. It actually looked like a Mac OS app, right? You know how Mac OS back in the when Mac OS first came out, everything was like a jelly bean, right? Very round and chromium and like little shines and stuff like that, round buttons and all that. Somehow they had built an IDE that looked like that. It looked like a child's plaything, like a toy. It was so multicolored, and it was beautiful. And I just tried it out, and I heard great things, and it was in this magazine that I really enjoyed, and I had loaded it up, and I was immediately struck by just how little it had, which is great because the stuff it had worked. Whereas with JBuilder, you had like 5,000 different things, none of which I wanted, and which caused the program to crawl inexcusably. And most of which there were dialogues in there that would just throw an exception. You'd see a splat in the exception in the wizard inside of JBuilder. And so I just remember what IntelliJ is. It's fast, it's lean, and it's obviously well. They had translucent windows. It used to be that there were panels on IntelliJ. I don't know if people realize this, but it used to be like Photoshop or something. We'd have like floating panels. And these panels were translucent. You could actually see you could see behind these windows. You could see the background of the operating system on Windows. And this has to be, Java 1.4 or earlier, right? This is a long time ago. I don't know how they did it. It always struck me as being a very nice touch, Anyway, that was a long time ago. And I'm still with it, obviously, big fan.
Josh, I was talking with Valentin, one of the founders of IntelliJ IDEA, who still programs for IntelliJ IDEA. And he was talking about the things that they missed in the popular IDEs back then. And this is the reason why they created IntelliJ IDEA, to do stuff which the developers need every day, like refactoring.
Yeah.
So they started with refactoring and they added a lot of other things to the IDE, of course, as it was growing.
Oh, yeah. And they did a great job, but it started with code. It was very code centric, whereas JBuilder and even Visual Studio, they all wanted you to, like, code was one view of your application, but you had these WYSIWYG tools and you had wizards to generate a mountain of XML for soap and whatever you had. You can point this wizard at something and it'll generate. It's just lots of code generation and wizards and just stuff that wasn't. I just want to write code. I want to just write Java code, please. Get out of my way. Stop making me go through these wizards and stuff. So the fact that it was all keyboard navigable and fast, and it's like, oh yeah. And you're right about that refactoring. Microsoft Visual Studio was the first IDE that I ever used that had really good auto completion, right? They called it IntelliSense, right? And I missed that. And when you go, then when I went to JBuilder and whatever, they had some of that, but it wasn't. It none of it felt particularly smart. It was slightly better than what I could have gotten out of like Emacs binding or something. It was not a huge step up because again, the text was just incidental. It was just another place that you would work with your application in a bunch of different modalities, as opposed to like being the prime master, the prime easel on which you painted. You had multiple modalities instead of just one very central thing, which is code. And so it wasn't like a great experience to write code in there. It was just sort of, it was okay, And then I remember, yeah, you're right. The refactoring, the awareness that you had when you were typing code, that feeling that the IDE knew more about what you were going to type than what you did. That struck me,
Josh, since you develop Spring applications, so what are the features which you have used in IntelliJ IDEA, which you think the other Spring developers should know of so that it makes their everyday work easier?
Well, okay, so the obvious one, the first and foremost is there's actually a really nice wizard to go to start.spring.io. So, and I go out of my way to avoid using this. And I like it. My whole life has been on stage. I love IntelliJ and I spend a lot of time in there. But when I show Spring Boot, when we first started showing people Spring Boot, I had to go out of my way to make people understand it. It didn't require Spring Tool Suite, which is our Eclipse, our set of plugins for Eclipse. It doesn't require IntelliJ or whatever, right? Because we had Spring Roo. Spring Roo was a nice code generation approach, and it solved a problem from a different time that makes a little sense today. But at the time, it had you couldn't argue that there was a problem that needed to be solved. Whether that was the best solution, maybe that's a different discussion. But the approach it took was to do code generation, and this required heavily on your IDE being aware of that code generation, right? And so to make that work, because you would write these entities, and the idea was that behind the scenes, you'd have this process that was kind of churning out all this code in response to your keystrokes. And it was, in theory, supposed to be separate from the IDE, but in practice, it was very much tied to your experience using the Spring Tool Suite and Eclipse and all that. And so if, I don't know that we ever got it really well sorted out inside of IntelliJ. So that was very much like you're using the Spring Tool Suite or you're not using the framework at all, right? Which is, not great, right? We maybe we missed an opportunity there. So when here comes Spring Boot, and the goal was to sort of, first of all, I didn't want people to think you had to use Spring Tool Suite, right? So I started using IntelliJ on stage, whereas before I would just do either one. I don't care, on stage I don't care. Like when I'm running my own code, I've just always had let's talk about this in a minute, but I've always loved IntelliJ. It's always been the thing that I used for my own personal pet projects and things like that, even when I had during my day job to use some other thing for whatever reason. But anyway, so I didn't want people to think you needed to use our particular flavor of Eclipse or Eclipse at all or anything, right? Spring Boot has nothing to do with your IDE experience. So I used IntelliJ in all my demos, right? Which actually suited me just fine because I feel very comfortable there and I was happy. But then because of that, I also didn't want people to think you needed to use like the paid premium version of IntelliJ. Amazing though it is, I don't want people to be scared away from Spring Boot just because I'm using this very, very sophisticated IDE that I have been lucky enough in my years in the open source community and for years before that in the Java ecosystem to have free copies of, right? So I know it's possible to get a free copy of it because you just go to, I'm sure it's the same now, but it used to be you could go to Java user groups and just, I almost always got a free copy of IntelliJ every few years at Java user groups. They just gave them away. I mean, it's very hard not to get a copy, but But nonetheless, I didn't want people to think you needed to use the premium version of it if you didn't have access to it. So I used IntelliJ, but I didn't use all the features that are unique to that, which augment but don't make the Spring Boot experience. So for example, you can write Spring Boot apps in Emacs. Inarguably you can, right? It's not great, but you can. And so I use IntelliJ for the Java support, but I would make sure to go to start.spring.io and show people that wizard in the browser. Now, what people, I try and remind people, but sometimes it escapes me. But there's actually, that start.spring.io is an API, right? And so it's not just a web page; it's an API that IntelliJ, NetBeans, and Eclipse and Visual Studio Code all have wizards for, right? So the first thing I would remind people of is you don't actually have to go to start.spring.io. Oh, it hurts to say that though, but you can just do it inside of IntelliJ. It's great. It's just file new Spring Starter project, that kind of thing, or Spring Boot project. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I think that Spring Boot has a pretty sophisticated meta model, right? And so as a result, whenever I use IntelliJ, what I want its ability to give me an awareness of my object graph, right? Because it understands Java code. Even though sometimes it doesn't quite understand all the stuff that Spring Boot is trying to do behind the scenes. And so you get false errors. Spring Boot is it's a framework with lots of objects and Java classes and code. And there's nothing better for navigating that code than IntelliJ. And so if you find yourself reaching for, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't look at I look at the objects. You can command click your way through a whole Spring Boot application. And so things like Command Shift A to look up files, or Command Shift whatever it is, Control Shift something on Linux or Windows, that kind of stuff. Just being able to navigate by keyboard is so valuable to me. Command click and then Command Shift A to look up things by type or class or whatever. What else do you have? Another thing that I love is inside of IntelliJ you have this really good autocompletion for properties that are based on the properties that Spring Boot supports, given the types that are on the class path. Now that in turn, again, quite like the wizard, quite like the start.spring.io wizard, is driven by an index that Spring Boot provides. So in theory, it's available to other IDs as well. But if you're inside of IntelliJ, it just works perfectly. It's really, really, really nice because you just hit control space. It's fast. You could, in theory, go to like the actuator / config props and then kind of command F and all that. It's just
right.
Wow, just control space. It's amazing. The other thing I love is that you have the Spring Boot. You have the ability to run multiple apps. You have like a little dashboard there. I forget what it's called in the bottom. You can actually see all the Spring Boot contexts and you can start and stop them. So if you're working in microservices, that's wonderful. You've got now the ability to load multiple, even if it's not a multi-module project. Like if you're working in microservices, you don't necessarily have a parent pom.xml with multiple modules. You have multiple discrete services. But sometimes you want to work on both things at the same time. Make a change here, make a change there, see the results. And before, I used to have to spin up a lot of different IntelliJ instances. One of the biggest boons for me has been the ability to just open these projects in the same window, basically now. That's a relatively new thing. I don't know what the official word or description for that is, but it's great. What else? There's just so much good stuff. Kotlin. I don't know if people have tried this, but one of the best ways to consume Spring is through Kotlin, and of course, there's no better experience for Kotlin than inside of IntelliJ. That's a huge feature. I don't know. There's no other way to do Kotlin as far as I know that works even a tenth as well. So check that out. What else? I mean, it's just endless. It's just there's just so many because Spring Boot is all about Java code. And this is all about, and IntelliJ is great at navigating Java code. It just works perfectly in that respect. You don't have XML deployment descriptors. There's no specialized servers you got to deploy to. It's just public static void main and Java code. It's the kind of stuff you would do in your university. Just regular objects working together. No servers or infrastructure. IntelliJ has great support for all that, but it's so nice, and so it's just fast. I love IntelliJ for that.
Josh, you touched on a lot of points and you covered a lot of things, which I'm sure all the Spring developers would love to know, because one of the great things that you mentioned was about the navigation. It's difficult to navigate through a bigger code base, and when you talk about an application which uses something like Spring Framework,
Right.
using control click or other shortcuts which display the code within a small window within
Yeah.
the editor, it's amazing how you can view the definition of those annotations and your interfaces without even going opening that file in another tab. So that's amazing. And as you
Right.
said, it's not just one thing, it's a combination of other things which kind of just appear when you need them, like the HTTP client window or the run window, where you can see the microservices, your endpoints.
Oh, the endpoints. Oh, that's so true. That's another thing. You can actually see all the endpoints that your application is going to surface. You can just click around there. Oh, so good. So good.
And the database window, and not a lot of developers use it in the way that it can be used to the best of its capability. Actually, it's not feasible for anyone to use all the features of IntelliJ
Nope.
IDEA. There's so many of them out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I use the database feature. I do use that actually. You have that's data grip as well, right? Like one of the things I love about IntelliJ is that it's sort of the breeding ground for all these things that sometimes just spin out and become their own product. So like the JavaScript support in IntelliJ eventually became at least the foundation for like WebStorm, right? And then obviously the core Java support eventually became Google's Android Studio foundational piece. And then the Scala support, that's still there, but it's a plugin. And then what else? I mean, data grip, the tooling for that. Don't you have also a version control thing? I don't even use the version control one. I think you have a separate version control system that was originally inside of IntelliJ.
There has been request to create a separate tooling for using the version control system. I don't know what the status of that is now.
Oh, okay, maybe I'm imagining it.
No. So as of now, we don't have it as a separate tool. Probably in the future, we might have.
Oh,
So yes, you're right. DataGrip IDE is one of the independent IDEs or tools that developers can use to access their database. And I was watching one of the presentations by Maxim, who leads the DataGrip IDE, and
yeah,
that was amazing. I was blown away. I said, "Oh my God, you can do this! Oh my God, you can do this too."
yeah,
This would have been awesome if I would have known about this feature when I was working on that XYZ application. It's kind of amazing to find out that there's so many things which we can do in the existing tool that we already have access to.
yeah. I use the one inside of the IDE all the time. I've been meaning to train on data grip because I understand conceptually, it's the same. It's just a standalone thing. It's in theory, I think I'd be very happy there. I just don't use it very often, but I do. I use the one inside the ID, inside of IntelliJ all the time. It's just wonderful. Yeah, you can do. It actually understands types, right? So I can actually like command click on it, like select all from cats, and then command click, and it'll show me the table and things like that. It's just brilliant. Really, really smart.
Yes, it can do a lot of things. It can connect you to your database, whether they are configured inside of Docker, outside of Docker. You can
Yeah.
actually browse the schema in a visual way. That's amazing. We're
Oh
showing
yeah.
all the links that you have in the tables. You can edit the values. And there was also another thing which would show you how much time it takes to execute a query and how you can optimize that. That was amazing.
And that's a good point, actually. Have you ever watched our friend Lucas Eder do a talk? He's a mad scientist. He's brilliant. He does Java OOQ for the people in the audience. He does the JOOQ or Java Object Oriented Query, and he like Vlad Michaela. These two people are some of my heroes when it comes to a lot of things, but especially when it comes to SQL. And Lucas is he's insane. I mean, his brain is different. It's not like, I think he's got like I don't know, maybe it was put in sideways. I don't know what his brain does that none of ours do, but he sits at a console and he says, I'm going to make SQL render fractals or things like this, stuff that just no enterprise use case has any business being anything close to, and yet he does it because he's got a great, amazing, amazing sense of imagination and a and a great brain. So, but the point is, he's able to do that because he's spent countless hours exploring SQL. Whereas for me, most of my career, it's just been me at a console. It's been PG SQL or PL SQL or whatever. I'm always using SQL servers, particular dialect. So there was a time when I knew how to create stored procedures by memory in SQL Server and Postgres and Oracle. Right, I knew how to do links and foreign keys and weird stuff like that, and I kind of understood it well enough that I could do it by memory. And I also kind of learned MySQL, right? And I've been lucky to be a developer advocate, right, for the last 11 years, and I've kind of forgotten a lot of that stuff because I don't need to. It's not critical to my day in day out experience of building software anymore because there's just it's just not nearly so important. And I would like to have that confidence again. Well, Lucas, he's got it, but he's special. Like I said, he's got a magic brain that the rest of us just don't have. And I feel like when I have a good tool that supports me, I can hit control space and I can explore and navigate and take risks and refactor. Oh, it really is. It's liberating, Like a simple example that is there's a shell script. It's not like the most sophisticated thing in the world, but there's actually shell script support inside of IntelliJ, right? Which is a far sight better than any other experience I've ever had writing shell scripts, because again, it's just not something for which there's just been traditionally a lot of tooling, right? And so I can open up, Emacs and write a shell script backwards with my eyes closed at this point, but I don't like to refactor this stuff. It's scary because if you change something, it'll break. You open it up in IntelliJ, you can start refactoring your shell script of all things. And that's really empowering. Suddenly shell script doesn't seem so scary anymore. Because the reason it's so smelly or whatever, the reason it's such a pariah in terms of like solutions is because it's write once, read never, right? It's one of those things like Perl where it works the first time, but heaven help you should you want to change it, Well, if you know you can refactor with impunity, if you know you can open it up and the IDE will give you guidance on what you did or didn't do, suddenly it becomes viable again. Suddenly the thing that takes the least lines of code is still a workable solution for the long term, for the long tail. And that's all because of good tooling like IntelliJ. It's amazing what a difference that makes.
I really like that term, write once, read never, because that's where you how you punish the other developers if you have to.
That'll teach them. Yeah. I wrote CGI and C. Do you remember CGI? You surely not. You've lived a good life. Me, I've made mistakes. CGI, right, was this way to do HTTP endpoints, and it was dumb. It was like the servlet spec before Java. It was just a contract you could use to create, and basically the contract was standard out would be rendered to the HTML page, right? So standard in was what the client was sending to you, and you write to standard out, and that would be responsible for producing the HTTP response. So you could do this with anything. You could write CGI scripts with Perl or C or Bash, and I did, Bash and C, which is I'm not proud, but now I kind of wonder. Do you ever use C Lion?
No, I haven't.
That's actually I've wanted something like that, right? I don't know much Go. I've never used GoLand. I use PyCharm all the time. I use WebStorm all the time. I use IntelliJ, and on occasion I use C Lion, and it's quite nice. It's the best C IDEA I've ever had the privilege of using. In all my decades of writing C, I've never felt particularly because you don't get good unless you practice, right? And you don't practice if you feel like you're gonna shoot yourself in the foot every time, right? And so again, that safety net that tooling around IntelliJ has always given developers, it makes you courageous. It makes you willing to try some things because you can always just refactor yourself back into a working state, So C Lion is great. I've been writing more C code, or at least updating old C code. It's just nice.
I wrote C in the beginning of my career, I think late 90s, early 2000.
Yeah.
Not really much after that. But I started as a person who was optimizing the SQL queries. So that was early 2000s. And I really thought it was fun to kind of deep dive into the schemas and optimize the SQL queries. And I used to love that. But of course,
wow.
I kind of grew and I started working with Java, and then it was less of the queries, but I still love anything which is related to the databases.
See, you're the person I would have on whose desk I would have knocked and asked for help, because I got to the point where I could confidently create a query. I just didn't know how to optimize it. I was just, because I was dealing with, I remember I never was stuck with one database long enough that I got any kind of mastery over it. I never had that privilege. And so I was just constantly trying to I remember key things I needed to do often, the nuances of creating a schema here, the nuances of outer joins here, the nuances of stored procedures. Those things tend to change from one database to another. And I just feel like I got with any given database, I got just to the point where I knew how to do that. And then I was okay for most of my scenarios. And then I left the company or whatever. So I never really got great at it. And you're the kind of person I would have asked for help because I didn't have data grip or anything like that to help me.
And if you're stuck now, probably IntelliJ IDEA would be the best to help you out.
Yeah. It's like I said, I just feel confident, perhaps unduly, but I am confident.
Okay, so that brings me to another interesting question. So let's say you are stuck on anything that you are doing while writing your applications. So what is, let's say, one or two IDEA features that you always use so that you are out of that, wherever you're stuck at?
Inside of the IDE. Well, okay, so normally if something goes wrong, I ask Dr. David Sire or Venkat Subramaniam. Doctors David Sire or Dr. Venkat Subramaniam. And if they don't know, then I start consulting the wise IntelliJ IDEA. So what things I can use to, the debugger, of course. I know I love debugging. I find it very cathartic just to be able to see the objects splayed out before me and kind of see things. So the debugger is your friend, learn how to set breakpoints, learn how to step over and do all that kind of stuff. I was having some issue. Okay, so inside of IntelliJ for Spring developers, you know what? I was actually debugging CSS. This isn't Java. This isn't Spring. I was debugging some cascading style sheets, and I was using WebStorm. And I was trying to figure out why a clause wasn't in effect, right? I noticed that WebStorm will actually gray out things that you've written that you think should apply, but they're not actually going to apply. And it can actually statically look at your web page, your markup, and go, "Hey, you wrote this, but we know for sure it's not going to apply. It's just going to be, it's unused effectively." How does it know? It's just amazing. It's like it's evaluating the DOM structure as you're typing. So that kind of stuff is great. But in terms of Spring Boot, yeah, I don't know. Let me think. There's when I do reactive programming, there's a bunch of tools, the Reactor Debug tools, or Reactor Tools, I think it's called. It's a standalone library. And this is for reactive data flow, right? Reactive composition, that kind of stuff. And reactive streams are neat, but they do change the way that you have to think about data flow, the movement of state in your application from one place to another. And so it becomes a little bit more difficult to insert yourself in the pipeline to see where things have changed. And there are operators that you can use in Reactor to sort of checkpoint the flow of data or to log the flow of data, that kind of stuff. But it requires that you have, in order for it to be efficient, it requires that you have certain libraries on the class path. Okay, and there's a bunch of things you need to, there's a static method you have to call before you run public static void main, before the rest of your Spring Boot applications, public static void main, and that kind of stuff. There's actually a checkbox inside of IntelliJ just saying enable those Reactor debug tools. It just does it for you. It's just like, oh, that's great, because this is only a thing you care about when you're trying to debug something. You don't care about it. You can do it the hard way, but there's just a little checkbox there. There's a checkbox for debugging. So in Spring Boot, if you say -- debug equals true, or just anything besides false, it'll turn on. What will it do? It'll show you the auto configuration report. The enumeration of which tests were ran, which evaluated to true, to false, and to sort of indifferent or whatever. It was going to run no matter what, and that tests all that stuff. I want to see that when I'm trying to debug something. I'm trying to figure out why something isn't kicking in, or why something that is kicking in is kicking in and it shouldn't be, or whatever. And so there's a little checkbox there when you run when you set up the run configuration inside of Spring Boot to just enable that checkbox, to enable debug. So that kind of stuff is great. I like all of that. What else? Yeah, I don't know. I guess the theme I guess one thing I've just started, as I'm talking to you, I'm realizing that one of the themes here is that there's a lot of stuff that you can do in Spring Boot if you know where to look. And if you're willing to write a few extra lines of code or enable a certain property or set up an environment for, this kind of stuff. Or you could just poke around in IntelliJ because it has all this stuff front and center. You just enable checkbox here, push a button there, go to a wizard here, control space over here, whatever. That kind of stuff is all just accessible to you, streamlined. What else do I use to debug? Debuggers, reactor debug tools, dash debug. I'm sure I'll think of other things. There's just a lot of stuff. There's just a lot.
What you said absolutely makes so much sense, because when you have a lot of things that you can use and configure, it becomes overwhelming. And if someone can just nudge you in the right direction, that makes so much of sense. And it really makes the lives of developers easy if they are able to use any feature with ease. Because, of course, using a debugger is one of them. You don't really have to figure out a lot of things yourself. You just set the breakpoints. You can set the conditions on them, and you have so many options in the debugger. It's amazing.
That's a skill in of itself, by the way. I don't think enough people learn how to debug. It used to be very hard. I used to use GDB, right? That's not easy. It couldn't be easier than IntelliJ's debugger, which is it's a miracle in of itself. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there. And people don't know what they don't know. So again, because it's surfaced in IntelliJ, they know what they should know, or at least what they could know.
Thank you so much, Josh. Spring developers would love to listen to all the tips that you have shared regarding working with Spring Boot and how they can navigate their way around in a Spring application in IntelliJ IDEA. Just one last question. Has IntelliJ IDEA helped you to be a happy developer?
Of course. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, it just gets out of my way. It's so, I don't, when I write, it is true today that everything is not code, right? It's always been true that the world is more than just the Java code that you write. And to the extent that IntelliJ makes working with all those artifacts that surround my Java code that are adjacent to it. So, for example, my shell scripts and my YAML files for Kubernetes resources and my Docker files, which I hate writing, but to the extent that IntelliJ supports me in all those other things, my HTML files, which get rendered as views, and my GraphQL schema, and all this stuff, my build, my pom.xml, all the stuff that isn't my Java code, to the extent that all feels as feedback loop intensive and rich as writing Java code, I am so grateful, because it allows me to stay in the zone, to stay in that flow of, I'm going to solve a problem, I'm going to hit control space until I get a solution, and then I'll go home on time, right? Java, and then the support for writing code, which is what I care about, that's second to none. It's just fantastic, and because I don't have to move my hands off the keyboard, because I can drive the whole thing, and it seems like an extension of my brain at some point. It goes so fast. That's wonderful. They've done studies where they look at the effect on the brain when you have like cycle time, when you have that continuous sense of moving forward, when you have that perception that you're constantly moving forward to an imminent horizon, you're making progress towards that horizon. That creates an endorphin rush. It's a very, very powerful stimuli for the brain, and it feels good, right? Writing code and not having the IDE say, this dialog just threw an exception, or you have to click on these 5 different wizards and all that. Not doing that is, it's everything. Just get out of my way. Just let me stay in my lane so I can just go faster and faster and faster, IntelliJ does that. It makes me happy. And I'm not saying I'm not saying it to be nice. I mean, it literally creates it induces the release of chemicals that are guaranteed to make me happy. And it's something I encourage other people to experience.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you so much again for sharing your experience with other Spring developers. I'm sure they would become better Spring developers and happy developers too after listening to all these words. Thank you so much. Good luck to you.
Bye, my friend. Thank you.
Bye.